Hey guys, welcome to Church Online this week. It's really great to be with you. Great to be bringing you the word and trust that you're always also well. God's doing great things in your life. And I'm really hoping that you've been challenged, inspired, encouraged in the series that we've been doing on generosity. And we are heading into our last Sunday today, our last week of this 3-part series we're doing called The Blessed Life. And really just hoping that it's having an impact. I know that for me, in prepping these sermons and in going through the material and studying the scriptures on this amazing topic, I'm always challenged, and really I have been in the last few weeks. And I also have seen God do some pretty amazing things in our life as well, as I've started just declaring some of these scriptures over us again and just believing Him for everything that He has for me and what it really means to live a generous life and also understand the generosity of the incredible God that we serve. It's kind of a two-way street. The more we get to know God, the more generous we should become, because that is how He is, and we become more and more like Him. And so in ending today, I kind of want to ask a question right up front and try and define something that is probably fairly difficult to define. And that is the question, what is generosity? What does it mean to be generous? And maybe as kind of a guiding line, let me ask a couple of questions and ask you if you would think if this would be a definition of generosity to you. Someone steals an expensive piece of equipment from their work and they sell it on eBay, and they take some of those proceeds from that and they give it to a charity. Is that generosity, or is that theft? It's theft. Another scenario, someone gets a bonus and it's a large sum of money, and they take some of it, quite a lot of it, and they offer it to the leader of a non-profit organization, but there's strings attached. So they say, you can have this, but I want you to use it the way that I say you must use it, in the time frame that I tell you to do it in, and I want you to use it for the pet project that I'm interested in. Is that generosity, or is that manipulation? So it's an act of giving, but which one is it? Of course, it's manipulation. Someone with an underachieving high school student who's battling to get into university is a very wealthy person. They go and make a massive donation to a university. Is that generosity, or is that strategic planning? Someone makes 100,000 Rand a month, and they go to a Christmas Eve service and they give 1,000 Rand to their local church on that evening. Is that generosity, or is that easing of a conscience? And someone makes 100,000 Rand a month, but prayerfully and joyfully takes 10% of their salary and they give it to their local church. Is that generosity, or is that obedience? It's obedience. We spoke about that last week. And so to define generosity is actually quite a difficult thing. There's all these different scenarios, there's all these different cases that we see that it can happen for the wrong reason, with the wrong motives. What does it come down to? Because surely it's not just about the act of giving. And in the New Testament, Paul gives this instruction to Timothy, who's a young pastor, and says to him, I want you to teach the people to be generous. And whenever I read that, I often think to myself, what kind of a job am I doing at teaching our congregation to be generous, like Paul would be instructing me today? In Buddhism, it's actually a very, very important concept, the idea of generosity. It's one of the 10 levels of perfection in Buddhism, and even in the Quran, it extols generosity as something that's an extremely important virtue. Pretty much everybody, wherever you look, would agree that generosity is a really good idea. But just finding one single definition to define what generosity is can be really hard. So some sentences, sort of one-liners, are generosity is liberality in giving. It's a magnanimous spirit. It's an abundance mentality, joyful exuberance in sharing stuff, willingness to sacrifice for others with no strings attached. Now, these one-line definitions may help us a little bit, but they really do battle to get to the core of the heart behind generosity. What is generosity? So what I want to do today is I want to look at 3 stories in the Bible that I hope will be able to give us some kind of framework and help us to get to the roots of this question. If we are to be generous as our God in heaven is generous, what does this mean and what does this look like? So the first story is that there's this single mom, and she's really struggling. And she's struggling to get by, and her toughest challenge of all time is that she faces this huge, her and the whole nation that she's in faces this massive famine. And because of the famine, food is scarce and very expensive, and basically she has no money for food for her or her one and only son. And so she takes the last little bit of flour that she has and some olive oil, and she's got this tiny little bit left over, and she decides, gathers a few sticks, she decides she's going to make a fire, she's going to make this little tiny little bit of bread, and her and her son are going to eat it, and then they're going to lie down together and they're going to die. At the same time, there's this prophet who's been used mightily by God, and his name is Elijah, and he is been used powerfully as a man of God, and God's not finished with him yet. He's still got some work for him to do. And so God tells him, I want you to go to this widow, and and you need to go and stay with her and rely on her for food. You can kind of see where this story is going and where we're coming to a clash here. So he gets there and he explains the whole situation to her. He says, God's told me that I'm to move in with you. And she says to him, well, you can actually just picture what she's thinking. That's no problem. You can have the whole place to yourself, because my son and I are going to have our last meal and then we're going to die. And he says, and not only that, not only am I going to move in here and have a room here, but you're also to feed me, and you're to feed me first before you guys. And she obviously just thinks to herself, this guy's crazy. But he said, God told me that you must do this. And if you do it, then but if you feed me first, God will resupply your flour and your oil. Now, I don't know what you'd be thinking in that situation, but I'm just going to be honest with you. If some crazy prophet rocked up at my house and gave me those terms, I'd chuck him right out into the street more than likely. And I'd say, get out of here. And the truth is, guys, that whenever God moves us towards a place of generosity, that same temptation comes in where we think, well, what about me? How am I going to get by? How am I going to survive? And I know that if I think back to when I was a very young Christian, before Eileen and I got married, in all honesty, we were both kind of really struggling students at that point. And actually, I started a business in Cape Town doing websites, and it went okay. But the truth is that there were many months, because of cash flow and a new business, that we really had very, very little. And we were counting our rands and cents as in, like, we didn't have enough to get by and to eat. And so I know exactly what it's like to be moved to a place of generosity when you just see in your lack how little you really have and how much you count the cost of it and how difficult it is for you. But the amazing thing is that in my life, as I've been obedient to God and to His voice, to do what He tells me to, not out of guilt or manipulation, but when I do what God tells me to do, and I believe that He'll resupply, He has always resupplied. Just a little while ago, a few months ago, my hairdresser, who's been cutting my hair for the last, probably about 10 years or so, it was her last day of cutting hair. So she had decided, she'd been a hairdresser for quite a long time. She had decided that she was going to have a career change. And she had always been so good to me, and she'd been my hairdresser for a long time, and she'd always done such a great job with my hair, and I loved going to her, and I was very loyal to her. I only ever went to her to get haircuts. And because it was her last day, I just felt, as I was paying, I just felt God say, I want you to give her some money when you pay for your haircut. And so I did, and it was, a fair amount, and it was a fair amount for me anyway in that moment. And I was obedient to God. And without even thinking about it, I just did it, and I said to her, thank you so much for cutting my hair over all these years, and I'm just praying God's blessing over you going forward in this new season for you. And I got in my car and I came home and kind of scratched around, did a couple of things in my day off, and then I went to a hardware store just up the road. It's a small family-owned business hardware store that I get some stuff from, and I had a wall that is at our place had a real disaster I need to replaster. And so I walked in there and I'd kind of realized in the past that this guy recognized me as a pastor, and he goes to our Kloof campus. He'd seen me preach online before, and I rounded up a few things that I needed. I need some stuff for plastering, and I needed some tools for plastering and all the rest of it. When I came to pay, he said, this is on me, there's no problem. It was literally maybe 2 hours after I had given this large tip, extra payment to the hairdresser. I remember just walking away from there going, God, you just never fail. You never ever fail to resupply when we give out of obedience to you. And it was kind of when I was a young Christian and I realized this and read through the scriptures like Matthew 6:33 that we should seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things will be added unto us. We shouldn't worry about money and seek God's kingdom and seek him first and be generous like him. And my God who will supply all of your needs according to his riches and glory. We read in Philippians, and I memorized all these scriptures when I was a young Christian. It was in that process that I really started tithing for the first time, and being a sort of 19-year-old, started actually giving 10% of everything that came in. Now, there's an interesting analogy when it comes to tithing that I wanted to give you guys today, because this idea of tithing is exactly this. It's that, God, I'm going to be obedient to you with 10% of my salary, and I'm going to trust you that you will resupply everything I have. And as we spoke about last week, God says, test me in this. And by the way, that's how everybody who ever starts tithing, how they do it, is they just take a step of faith and they say, God, I don't know how this is going to work, but I'm going to test you, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to believe that you're going to resupply. Now, there's an interesting sort of analogy that goes with this, and I wish I had a whiteboard, but unfortunately I don't. But if you can imagine with me on this whiteboard here, there's a very interesting thing that happens with tithing. So tithing, you get two different kinds of people, two Christians that sit in church every single week, maybe watch online. And the one kind of Christian says, listen, I've got to go from A to B in life. And from A to B, I need 100% of my salary, of my income. And this is the mark that I have to hit. I've got to pay bills at the end of the month. I've got to get my kids through school. I've got to save up for their university. I've got to save up for retirement. And if I don't use 100% of my income, there is no way that I'm going to be able to afford this. I need 100% to do it. That's the first kind of Christian. The second kind of Christian says, look, I've also got to get to B. I'm just as concerned about getting there as you are. I'm also a numbers person. I also understand that it's going to take everything. But I believe the scriptures. I believe that when God says that he will resupply, when God says that he will provide for me, that he'll open the floodgates of heaven, all the rest of it, I actually believe that God is true to his promise. And so I'm going to live off 90%, and 10% I'm going to tithe. I'm going to give to the local church. But then there's this other category that exists in my life called C. Not only am I going from A to B, but there's this extra category that opens up in trust in God, which is called B to C. And that's the favor of God. That's the provision of God. That's the trust in God. That's the blessing of God. Now, again, guys, don't ever think that that's just financial. Finances are just one part of that. That's everything in life. It's the supernatural favor of God from B to see that it's not just on me anymore. This is not just about me hitting that number. God, I'm trusting you with the supernatural, with that rest, that B to C. Now, there's a very interesting thing about these two people, because they can sit next to each other in church. They can sit a couple of rows apart from each other. And both the other person thinks that the other one's an idiot. They both think the other one's an idiot. The first guy says, you're an absolute idiot. You drinking the Kool-Aid from the pastor and you believing what these guys are saying in the church world, that if you give 10% that you're going to be okay. You're an idiot and you're crazy. You're never ever going to get to B. And you're going to get sunk if you're trying to live off 90%. But the other person also thinks that guy's an idiot, because he's going, what are you talking about? You may get to B, but you're going to stand there and worship every week and say, God, I trust you. I give my life to you. I surrender to you. But you can't deal with your finances. You're an idiot. They both think the other person's an idiot. So the question is, what kind of idiot do you want to be? Which kind of idiot are you going to be? And for me, a long time ago, I decided I was going to be the second idiot. And I could regale you guys with story after story after story, like the little one that I just told, but so many more in my life, how I've seen B to C stories, how it hasn't just been about getting from A to B for us, but we've seen God come through supernaturally. So let's finish the story about Elijah and the widow. He moves in. He says to me, you feed me first. She takes a little bit of flour that she has, a little bit of oil. She believes that this is what God is saying. And so she goes and she bakes him some bread, and she goes and gives it to him, and she said, that's it, there's none left. And when she returns back to the kitchen again, she realizes that the jar has been filled up, and that there's enough for her to make for her son now. Supernaturally, it's been resupplied, it's been replenished. So she makes for her son, she goes back to her son, she gives it to him, gives him some bread, and she goes back in again, and it's been replenished. And she makes some for herself, and it's replenished. And the whole way through the famine, that jar, a little bit of jar of olive oil and flour was replenished as she trusted God and she was obedient to God in giving him what he said she should give. He was the one who resupplied for her. The second story is about David and King David, of David and Goliath fame, and David, hard after God, David in the Psalms, David. So it's an amazing story that happens with David because of his love for God and his obedience to God. God blesses him like just about almost no one else that we see in the Bible. Maybe him and Solomon stand alone there. But this literally in the Bible, we call this the golden era. And everything that David touched turned to gold. He was a fantastic leader. He was an amazing politician, an artist, a poet, a warrior, an orator. And he was one of the most famous guys that have ever lived in Israel. And so what happens is he becomes, everything just goes well for him. And everything that he touches turns to gold. And because of this, and because his kingdom is growing and everything just working out so well, he had always been a guy who gave God all the credit. He'd always been a guy who said, I'm nothing without you, God. I trust you wholeheartedly for everything. We just see his bare, honest heart towards God right through the Psalms. But he goes through this funny little patch, and he starts changing the narrative a little bit. And he starts saying, hey, well, actually, I got here because I worked really hard. And I got here because, I conquered Goliath, and I did this and I did that. And he starts sort of bragging. And so he calls one of his friends in the command of the army, a friend he'd grown up with, and he says to him, I want you to go out and I want you to number our troops. I want you to count all of our troops and come back and tell me what that number is. And this was something that was really not a good thing to do. In fact, it was prohibited. And his friend tells him that. He says to him, I know why you want to do this, David. You want to do it because when you're with your foreign kings and with your other friends, you want to brag about how great your army is and say, this is the number that we have in our army. And please, I beg you, David, don't do that. Remember how God blessed us. Remember how we came up as young kids together, just shepherd boys, and how God has just opened door after door for us, and how it's been his hand and it's been him, and he's the one who should get all the glory for everything that happened. I beg you, don't do this. Don't number your troops. Don't make it about you. Don't get a big head. Now David looks at him and says to him, number the troops. Go out and do it. And so he does, and we'll come back to that in a bit, what it is. But I wonder how many of us get into a situation where God really does bless us, where doors open up for us, where things go well for us, where maybe you started off young and you kind of were ambitious and you went out and you said, God, I need your help and I need to try and do something with this life. I need to make a success of it. And after time, maybe God does. And maybe looking back, you achieved some things you never thought you'd be able to achieve. God opened some doors you never thought would be open. I know that's definitely the story of my life. But at some point, we have to be so careful to never get to the place where we start thinking that we did it, that we were the ones who opened the doors. I'm a self-made man. It was me. I worked hard, and that's the reason why. And so this friend comes back to David and he says to him, I'll tell you the number. It's $1 million, and it's 1.3 million. There you go. Brag to all your friends about it. And it's amazing because as his commander tells him that, David realizes what he's done wrong. And he realizes that he's got the whole thing completely wrong. And what should be just a situation of God getting all the glory, he made it about himself. And there was David was disciplined, and it was really harsh. The discipline that comes in, you can go and read about it if you want, but it's really harsh, the discipline. And eventually God's discipline ends, and David humbles himself before God, and he comes back to God and he says to him, God, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I got to this place and that I lost my heart of recognition that everything that I have, everything that I've ever done has been because of you. And so he says, this is what they did in those days when you got something majorly wrong like this. He says, I'm going to take an altar, I'm going to build an altar, and I'm going to sacrifice an animal on it. And so he goes to this field and he says to the guy who owns the field, I want to buy this field and I want to build this altar here. And when he gets to the guy, this guy says to him, no, you're the king. You're not going to get your hands dirty. I will give you the field for free, and I will give you workers for the altar, and I'll give you the sacrifice for the altar and everything. You're the king. It's all yours. You can have it. And David says, famous line, he said, I will not bring my God something, an offering that cost me nothing. I will not bring God an offering that cost me nothing. And at that moment, he had restored his integrity, saying that, God, I need to give you my best because I acknowledge that everything that I have comes from you. Now, I wonder if you've ever had an occasion where you feel like you've given God second best. And in all honesty, guys, that really our offering and the way that we give, whatever it is, when we give our second best and when we give a half-rate sort of offering to God, it really represents our hearts. As we spoke about in the first week, there is no truer reflection of our heart than the way that we bring an offering to God. And David said, I could never ever bring you something that didn't cost me, because how could I bring a God who's given me everything? It cost him everything. How could I bring him a second-rate offering? And so I would encourage every single one of us that when we bring our offerings to God, we would start with the place of knowing that everything that we have comes from him. And whatever that offering is, it's not about the amount. We're going to address that now in a second. It's not about what that offering even is. We're not even talking about money here. But when you have your quiet time, when we serve a church, when we give ourselves in prayer, when we worship God, all of these areas, let's always remember that we could never bring God something that cost us nothing. We should be giving him all that we have. The third and final story that I want to talk about is from the New Testament, and quite a famous one, and I really want to intentionally end this series with this story. It's just an awesome story, and it represents so well what this whole generosity thing is really all about. There's this kind of odd situation and this odd thing that happens with Jesus. In fact, the only time it's recorded in the scriptures that Jesus did this, but he sits down and he watches the people putting their offerings into at the synagogue where they used to bring their offerings, and it's a very interesting scenario because he's observing these people and he's teaching his disciples at the same time, and he turns to them and he says, guys, I want to just paraphrase this a little bit, but he turns to the disciples and he says that small gifts really matter to my Father. You know, the big ones are, they're great and they're awesome and they're fantastic, but sometimes people give big gifts and it's not even a speed bump in their income or in their lifestyle or in what they have. There's no adjustment, there's no less dinners that they're eating out. It's really made no difference, even though they bring in a big amount. But when somebody brings in a small amount that costs them something, that they have to adjust their life around it, that really makes my Father take notice. That is really something so special, because a huge demonstration of faith is so the third and final story that I want to share today is from the New Testament, and it's this really interesting occasion where we see recorded a situation only once that we see this in the New Testament. Jesus did this sort of odd thing. He watches all the people bringing their offerings to the temple treasury, and he kind of sits there and watches them, and then he turns to the disciples and starts teaching, and there's this widow who comes in who gives 2 mites. In fact, it's such a famous story that it's kind of become a colloquial phrase now, the widow's mites, in modern language. And she brings in her 2 mites, and it's really, in those days, it's a very small amount. And he turns to his disciples and he starts to teach them here, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but he says to them, guys, I want you to know that small gifts really matter to my Father in heaven. Some people bring in the big amounts, and that's fantastic and that's amazing, but sometimes people bring in big offerings and big amounts, and do big things and give big things, but really it's no sacrifice at all. It's not even a speed bump on their income radar. It requires no adjustment to their lifestyle. They can still have as many dinners as they used to have before they brought in that offering. They can still live the same comfortable lives that they used to live. There's no sacrifice, there's no adjustment. And really, it's not about the amount that's given, but it's about the faith act that's given. It's about the size of the faith that counts, not the size of the quantity. And I say this and I bring this story up because I honestly think that we have one of the most generous churches that I know of. And I mean that, guys. I say it to our church so often. We really do. We have one of the most generous churches that I've ever come across. And it's incredible to see how people give and tithe and bring in their amounts. And I don't check the bank accounts or anything like that, but I can just see that and just know that people give so sacrificially in our congregation. And what I want everybody to know is that there may be many people who feel like they're in a situation in their lives where they think maybe what I have to give isn't going to count. It's not going to do anything. And it's so clear in the scriptures that it's not about the amount that we bring in, but it's about our obedience in it and our heart towards God in the act of giving it and our faith that's connected to what we're giving. That's what God is after. That's what he takes notice of. And so when we had Heart for the House this year, and Heart for the House is a time where we take up a once-off offering, and I'll tell you guys, the most gut-wrenching moments for us is when we count the money that's given to the Heart for the House offering, the cash that comes in on the day. And many people who didn't write down their names, but you see the amounts that came in. And when you see the amounts that come in, and you see these large amounts that come in, it really is mind-blowing to think that people would be obedient to give some of the sums of money that we see come in. But in all honesty, guys, the thing that is the most heart-wrenching out of the whole thing is to see the small amounts come in, knowing that there's some people in our congregation, there's some people in our midst who are giving out of complete sacrifice, but because of obedience to God. And I share all of this because I never ever want anybody to feel like you don't have much to offer because your offering isn't that big in the number, in the quantity. It's not about that. Let me tell you that if you give in obedience to God, it is not about the amount that you give. It is about the kind of offering that you bring to God and the sacrifice that you make when you do it. Some people will think that my 10 rand is not going to count and my 20 rand is not going to make a difference. And there's some people that if you're earning a small amount, maybe you just feel like, well, there's no point in tithing. There's no point in giving. Guys, let me tell you, if we're thinking like that, we've missed the boat completely. There is always a point in giving. There is always a point in offering because it is not about the amount. It is about your heart towards God, your obedience to him, and the faith involved, the size of faith that you have. And let me tell you that if you do that, God says that if you're faithful with a little, he will give you more. One of the ways that we can increase our influence, increase our the stewardship that God has given us is just the Bible is so clear about this, guys, is just being faithful with the little bit that he's given us. Wherever you find yourself right now in your current situation, I want to close this whole series by challenging all of us. Let every single one of us be stronger in our generosity coming out of a series like this, understanding the heart of God, understanding that he has given us everything, that he's given his best to us, and he cannot be anything other than a generous, just a God who pours out so many blessings, and every good thing that we have comes from him. And I pray that every one of us would get stronger in our generosity, and that every single one of us would be just challenged and level up a little bit here when it comes to our heart towards God, when it comes to what we're going to bring him in the way that we're going to do it. That he deserves our very best. And I really trust that this series has challenged you like it's challenged me to say, okay, God, what kind of offering am I bringing you? It is not about the amount. It is about my heart towards you. It is about my faith towards you. And it's about my love for you and acknowledging you with my finance, with everything in my life. And with that, let's close in prayer. Lord, I thank you for this awesome series that we've done, God. I pray, Jesus, as we come to an end here, that every single one of us would be challenged, Lord. You know our hearts. This is an issue between us and you. You know what's going on in our lives, God. You know that you're able to resupply whatever we give to you when we do it out of a place of obedience. An acknowledgement that everything that we have comes from you. For those of us that have done well, God, I pray that you would get all the glory for that. For those of us who are battling, God, and just feel like we don't know where to start and we're in over our heads, Lord, I pray that we would be like that widow and just say, Lord, I will be obedient to you and I will trust you. I will trust you. And no amount is too small for you. No amount is too small and no amount is too big. And so we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, trust has been a blessing to you guys, and I've really enjoyed teaching the series. We're looking forward to starting a new series next week. It's going to be a lot of fun to do that. But between now and then, trust that you all are doing really well, and hope to see you soon. God bless everybody.